was really helpful. Well, folks, why don't we get going? It's so nice to see you all here. I'm Ed Steinfeld. I'm the director of the Watson Institute, and it's really my pleasure to introduce Derek Penslar. As I mentioned, Omer Bartov will be joining us shortly. Let me do a very brief introduction. Derek Penslar is the William Lee Frost Professor of Jewish History at Harvard. He's the director of undergraduate studies within the history department and directs Harvard's Center for Jewish Studies. Professor Penslar takes a comparative and transnational approach to modern Jewish history, which he studies within the context of modern nationalism, capitalism, and colonialism. His books include a biography, Theodor Herzl, The Charismatic Leader, which came out in 2020, Jews in the Military, A History, which was published in 2013, Shylock's Children, Economics and Jewish Identity in Modern Europe, 2001, and Zionism and Technocracy, The Engineering of the Jewish Settlement in Palestine, which came out in 1991. Professor Penslar's current interests lie in international history, and he's writing a book about worldwide reactions to the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Professor Penslar's topic today will be, as you can see, the use and abuse of historical analogy in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So again, thank you, Derek. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. So I'm really sorry that I'm not there in person. I have COVID, and I've managed to avoid it until now. And I'm not doing so well, but hopefully I'll get through a lecture. I'll do my best. And if I'm a little not quite on my game, hopefully you'll be forgiving. But I do want to talk about the way that both Israelis and their supporters and the way that Palestinians and their supporters have gotten trapped in a rhetorical strategy of their own making, which is that of analogy, that is conceiving of the conflict as it now exists in terms of certain historical frameworks that I'll outline in just a second. But just to define my terms, when I use the term Israel-Palestine, I'm not making a political statement. It's simply that there are people who conceive of it of Palestine as Palestine. There are people who conceive of the territory, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean as Israel, or part of it is Israel. And I just call it Israel-Palestine because it's obviously a contested area. And there is a state of Palestine that was declared in 1988 that's recognized by 2/3 of the countries in the United Nations General Assembly. The state of Israel has almost universal international recognition and is recognized by the UN and so on. But more important, I feel like I need to, as it were, reclaim or validate certain very important key terms when we talk about the conflict. One is that why do we call it a conflict? It's become, I think, popular in the last few years, particularly among people who identify with the Palestinian cause, to call it a struggle. They talk about the Palestinian struggle against Israel, the idea being that if you conceive of Zionism as a colonial movement, which I think is actually one of the two historical analogies I'll be talking about tonight, if you conceive of it that way, then when you try to overthrow the colonizer, that's a struggle. The problem is that if you want to call it that's fine, but it's also a conflict. That is, a conflict is a kind of value-neutral term that simply suggests an animosity, a dispute over interests, a dispute over land, resources or whatever between two parties. That is, struggles are a subset of conflicts. Conflicts are not a subset of struggles. For the Israelis, it is, they certainly perceive it as a conflict. And I've also heard, very interestingly, from people who identify with the Palestinian cause that we don't want to talk about, for example, what's happening now in Gaza as a war, because a war, according to this rather shaky logic that I've been hearing, a war assumes an equality of strength between the parties, which is, of course, not true. I mean, in 1975, Andrew Mack introduced the concept of asymmetric warfare precisely to account for anti-colonial situations where one of the two sides is much weaker than the other, and so resorts to all sorts of tactics, like terrorism, for example, or guerrilla warfare, in order to equalize the balance. So in other words, for us to call what's going on now a conflict, or to call the particular spasms of violence now, of tragic violence of war, I think is, it's not really problematic. A few kind of underlying principles that would apply, I think, for any subject, but I think particularly when we study Israel-Palestine and the background to the horrible, horrific violence of the last 6 weeks. One is the whole purpose of historical inquiry. It sounds kind of obvious, but it should be open-ended. It should not have a predetermined outcome. I can't tell you how many times over my decades in rank where students have said to me, I want to invite so-and-so speaker who, works on history because this person's work confirms my particular interpretation of the situation. Good historical inquiry is open-ended, and students who want to learn history ideally would be willing to accept conflicting interpretations of a historical narrative. I've also often heard in pro-Jewish or pro-Zionist, pro-Israel circles, many times I've heard in my career that the problem is that young people today, I'm thinking of many people in synagogues I've heard, who say young people today don't know the facts. And if you just tell them the facts, then they're somehow going to know that the interpretation that my interlocutor has about the conflict is correct. But of course, this is not true because history is at best able to determine truth and falsehood. That is right and wrong in the empirical sense of the word. History in and of itself cannot determine ethical rights and wrongs. At the end of the day, if someone holds beliefs that validate a Jewish claim on Palestine or a Palestinian claim on Palestine, history is at best used as a vehicle or a weapon, which is, I think, inappropriate to justify this really highly emotional or ideological perspective. So then the question is, what should historians do? Well, history does not allow you to predict the future. I've heard so many times in my career Santayana's line that those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat its mistakes, but actually history doesn't repeat itself. It's always a little different, and we have to keep that in mind. And also, again, to sort of work against an increasingly popular view about this conflict in the academic world, I have been told that I should never describe this conflict as complex, because complexity, so I've been told, is a euphemism for moral, sort of the abandonment of moral values. If you say it was complex, then you're basically saying no one was responsible. This is not true. What's been happening in Israel-Palestine for the last 75 years is enormously complex. It is factually, it is epistemologically hugely complex. That is not a rationalization. That is not a justification. It just is complex, and there's nothing wrong with that. And then, last and certainly not least, the purpose of an academic conversation, in my view, and this is very different from what's going on, let's say at the Harvard campus, perhaps not so much at Brown, I don't know, you can tell me, is I believe the purpose of conversation about a war in a university setting should not be to replicate the conflict, to replicate the emotional atmosphere with people taking sides. And, it should actually be to understand the causes and the course and the consequence. People are completely entitled to their affective views and to their attachments. But if all we do is replicate the conflict, we've failed. So I'm going to be talking now particularly about analogy, which is the use of historical evidence from a different time, a different place to justify policy in the present. And sorry, I'm going to have to cough from time to time, but I can mute myself. My former Oxford colleague, Yuen Phoon Kong, wrote a wonderful book some years ago called Analogies at War, about how American foreign policymakers during the Vietnam years drew on kind of a salad or a mixed bag of analogies, whether it was from Munich, the Munich Pact agreement of 1938, to give the Sudetenland to Hitler, or whether it was the Korean War, and the American decision to draw a firm line in the sand against communism, or whether it was the French defeat in Vietnam at Dien Bien Phu. American policymakers were awash in analogies which they used in order to justify escalation in 1965. And Kong's argument is really about the mistaken use of analogy. There's another kind of analogy that I'm going to be focusing on now, which is where we have a hegemonic framework. It's not just, we're going to look at a zillion different events. In the hegemonic framework, we look at each side in the conflict has one enormous, omnipresent analogical framework. So for the pro-Israel side, it is anti-Semitism, and in general, and the Holocaust in particular. And for Palestinian cause, it's colonialism in general, and the Nakba in particular, the Palestinians' loss of their homes and homeland, their dispossession in 1948, and their ongoing dispossession ever since. So I'll talk first about Zionism and the idea of, as I say here, the eternal end. There's a phrase that appeared almost immediately after the October 7th Hamas massacre, the worst day in Jewish history since the Holocaust. Deborah Lipstadt, the Biden administration envoy on anti-Semitism, said it. Yair Lapid, head of an Israeli centrist party, said it. An IDF spokesperson said it. I mean, it just seemed to be in the air. And now it's being used all the time. The worst day in Jewish history since the Holocaust. So immediately, people in Israel tried to understand the slaughter of 1,200 civilians in the most cruel and barbaric way, not as a war crime in and of itself, but as something related to the Holocaust. And that, I think, is a nice introduction to this issue. The fact that the Zionist movement from its very beginnings absolutely did not center entirely around anti-Semitism, Jewish physical insecurity, and the need for a safe homeland. This is not true. It was a concern. But when you look at the writings of perhaps the most famous early Zionist, Theodor Herzl, he does write about Jewish safety. He also writes about the need of Jews for dignity, honor, pride, and that having a state would make them respected by the world. There's a lot going on in early Zionism. It's not just about anti-Semitism and safety. A lot of Jews who were concerned about safety simply left Eastern Europe for the Western Hemisphere. That's where most of them went. I mean, only 5% or something of the Jewish migration stream in the later 1800s, early 1900s actually went to Palestine. And many of them were idealists. But the idealism had to do with much more than anti-Semitism and fear of persecution. It had to do with a desire to build a new Jewish national home. It had to do with the desire to create a new culture centering around the modern Hebrew language. It had to do with a kind of romantic nationalist love of the soil and the idea that Jews should become farmers and reclaim their connection with the land of Israel. That is, early Zionism really was a form of romantic nationalism in which fear of anti-Semitism was really only one component. So the question is, how did Zionism change so that the aspects of fear and the idea of Israel as a safe haven for the Jews, how did that become paramount? Well, not surprisingly, it became paramount with the rise of mass persecution of Jews in the 1930s, not just in Germany, but in Poland and other European countries. Most of the Jews who moved to Palestine in the 1930s were Polish, actually. 3/4 were Polish, only 1/4 were German. And they were trying to get away from a really, horrible situation, economic persecution, anti-Semitism, and so forth. And then during the war came the first inklings of the mass persecution, the transformation of millions of Jews into refugees. There was a conference of Zionist luminaries in New York City in 1942, at a time when the full extent of the Holocaust was not yet known. That is, they didn't know that 2/3 of the Jews in Europe would be killed, and already by 1942, many of Europe's Jews had been killed. What they thought is there would be millions of refugees after the war. And they demanded a Jewish state. It was the first time, by the way, that the Zionist organization formally demanded a Jewish state, as opposed to something a bit more ambiguous. And it was directly tied to the notion that Jews are persecuted and homeless and stateless, and they're going to need a place to go after the war. So this is really how and when Zionism became, I'd say, focused on anti-Semitism, persecution, and a safe haven. Now, what happened, though, in during the Second World War, of course, is that most of the Jews who would have moved to that Jewish homeland were killed. So in some ways, the raison d'etre for a Jewish state was actually cut out from underneath the Zionist movement's sort of underlying framework. But there was another issue, which was there were hundreds of thousands of Jewish displaced persons, stateless and displaced persons, not stateless necessarily, who were in refugee camps in Germany and Austria. A lot of them had tried to repatriate. They tried to return to Poland, for example, and they encountered vicious anti-Semitism. There were pogroms after World War II that killed several thousand, or at least a couple of thousand Jews. So a lot of Jews wound up escaping into refugee camps in Austria and in Germany. And there was a worldwide question about what to do with these displaced persons. Where are they going to go? And the fact is that Europe neither wanted them, nor did the Jews necessarily want to be there. The United States only took small numbers, as did Canada. And many of the refugees actually wanted to go to Palestine, or so they said. And so the idea of a Jewish state as a safe haven for Jews then really became ingrained into the Zionist movement just after the war. And a very important component of this association increasingly of Zionism with rescue of Jews in the wake of the Holocaust. A very important aspect of that was the delegitimization of Palestinian nationalism by associating all of Palestine's 1.2, 1.3 million Arabs really with one man, with the Palestinian leader Mohammed Amin al-Husseini, who had been the most prominent Palestinian leader during the 1920s and 30s, and who had spent the war years in Berlin, where, or at least part of the war years in Berlin, where he worked for German overseas radio as a propaganda broadcaster, where he broadcast explicitly anti-Semitic and pro-Arab nationalist messages. And so, you know, this was used then, and this famous photograph of him meeting with Hitler became a kind of a symbol or a metonym for Palestinians everywhere, even though the fact is that far more Palestinians fought for the British forces than, let's say, in the entire Middle East. The number of Arabs who fought for the Axis was very small, but most Arabs in World War II who fought for the British, and many Arab intellectuals during World War II were actually quite anti-Nazi. There were some who supported the Nazis, largely because the enemy of my enemy is my friend, as the adage goes. And if Arabs were seeking independence from Britain, which was the hegemonic power in the Middle East, then they would ally with Nazi Germany. But, oops, sorry about this. So yeah, the establishment of the Israel-Palestine connection then became just a staple of Israeli culture, an absolute staple that basically Arabs were the continuation of Nazis by other means. This became a very powerful trope in Israeli culture. There was a story published in the early 50s by a Yiddish writer who had survived the war in the Vilna ghetto. The story has just been translated into English just 2 weeks ago, in which in the story, this man has gone from Eastern Europe to Israel to fight in the 1948 war. And he captures an Arab soldier, only to find that the Arab soldier is a German soldier, whom he then bayonets with quite a lot of force and anger. So, and this motif became even more clear in Israel's first major feature film of 1955, Hill 24 Doesn't Answer, where a kind of frisky, cheeky Israeli soldier saves the life of what he thinks is a Jordanian fighter, but no. So I'm going to play you just a few minutes from this movie.
דברים כאלה עולים כסף. נראה מה שיש לך שם. טוב, נראה איך אפשר לסדר את זה, אז איזה שפה אתה מדבר? מה, אתה אילם? תחכי ערבי, שפריסט du Deutsch. תגיד לי שאתה מדבר עברית, You speak English? Okay. Easy, I know, that's all, see? Now, let's take off that shirt, Oh, come on. Come on, let's take it off. Nazi. Don't talk German. Nazi.
Yes, I was a Nazi, but I couldn't help it. Nobody could, no. Adolf Hitler. Did you ever see his eyes? That was a great power. We had to obey. He could do with us anything he wanted. We couldn't help ourselves. What would you do in my place, eh? What could you do? Yes, we did some terrible things against your people, I mean. Those were our orders. One? I tell you why I'm here. Not because I want to fight the Jews. No. Just because I want to fight. Just fight. Anybody. Anything. I did not learn something else. We are born to fight, isn't that true? When there are no more wars, we'll have to invent them. Yeah? What you going to do with me? You're going to kill me? I'm a wounded prisoner. There's a law. Your army. What do they do with prisoners like me? You mustn't do what we did. We were wrong. It was against religion what we did. You are religious, yes? Yes. You must be. After all, this is the Holy Land. And you are the ones who gave us the Ten Commandments and Christianity. Christ was a Jew. And he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. You and I, we are soldiers. You must forgive me. It is your law, isn't it? Isn't it? Why don't you speak? Of what you accuse me? Who are you anyway? You lausiger Jude! You don't know who I am! Obersturmführer der Waffen-SS, Otto Ritterhoff! Jawohl, Otto Ritterhoff! Are you afraid? Ja, das war doch immer so. The dirty little gypsy mongrel is a coward. Okay, give me the gun. I do it for you. You have the word of a German officer. Go ahead. Give it me, please. All right. Then you do it. Go ahead. Go ahead, do it. Shoot. Obersturmführer der Waffenlände, Otto Ritterhoff, zu Befehl! Soldaten, vorwärts, vorwärts! Wir sind die jungen Adler des neuen Deutschlands! Vorwärts! Deutschland ist die Welt!
That was a long clip, but I think it really makes the point. And this becomes just endemic in Israeli culture. In 2015, the eternal prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, claimed that Hitler had actually gotten his idea to exterminate European Jewry from Amin al-Husseini, that Hitler was just thinking about expelling the Jews from Germany, but Husseini really came up with the idea of mass extermination. So this view became very common in the 1950s, especially because Egypt had hired ex-Nazi rocket scientists for its defense industry, just like the United States did. But the fear of German Nazi scientists, this became, again, part of the warp and woof of the country's culture. And then the Holocaust became even more, I'd say, ingrained into Israel's identification or identity through the trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961, one of the architects of the final solution, in which Holocaust survivors gave testimony. And the country really developed a kind of a political culture centered around the Holocaust. And it's interesting that in 1967, on the verge of the war that Israel wound up winning quite spectacularly, the 1967 Six-Day War, a political leader at the time, Yitzhak Tebenkin, a leader of a kind of militant, both socialist and militant political party, said that if Israel's destroyed, it would even be worse than the Holocaust. Because after the Holocaust, the world placed all of its faith, all of its, the Jewish world placed all of its identity, all of its spiritual energy in Israel. So if Israel were destroyed, this would be the end of the Jewish world. And there were similar fears in 1973, despite, Israel itself was not attacked in 1973. Territories that it occupied in 1967 were attacked in the Golan Heights and in the Sinai Peninsula. But there was tremendous fear in Israel during this war because the Arab armies did very well for the first several days. And it was also a very costly war in terms of lives. Over 3,000 Israelis were killed in a country whose population was, about 40% of what it is now. So these fears and the use of the Holocaust analogy at all times just developed more and more, especially when Menachem Begin, a Polish Jew who himself had lost his family during the Holocaust, became prime minister in 1977 and angrily rejected the international community's demands for Palestinian statehood with specific references to the Holocaust. As he said in 1982, when the cabinet was debating whether or not to invade Lebanon to root out Palestinian guerrilla bases, he said the only alternative to invasion is Treblinka. And here we see him with a few choice words for the German chancellor at the time, Helmut Schmidt, who would like to see Israel foster a Palestinian state.
וזה מייעץ לי, הצ'אנסלר הגרמני, הוא יודע מה ביטחוננו ואני לא? אני הופקדתי על ידי העם לשמור ביטחונו. זו חובתי הקדושה. והוא נותן לי עצות לכל אירופה ולכל העולם, איך להכריח אותנו לקבל מדינה פלסטינית, הרי זה מעשה איבה שלא היה כמוהו. וממי הוא בא? מבנו של העם הנושא באחריות בעד רצח שליש מן עמנו, 6 מיליונים, דבר שלא קרה מאז האלוהים ברא את האדם והאדם יצר את השטן. הוא ייתן לנו עצות איך לשמור על ביטחוננו, הוא יפקיר את דמנו, הוא ינהל תעמולה למען מדינה פלסטינית.
So as you can see, he doesn't agree with the German chancellor. So Holocaust became, I'd say, increasingly central to the country's political culture, its educational culture. Shoah or Holocaust became a separate category for the country's baccalaureate exam in the early 1980s. The meaning of Holocaust or of Nazi imagery became, I'd say, somewhat motile. It began to float around. Basically, it became a way of demonizing not just non-Jews, but even Jews. So a couple of 16-year-old kids came up with an idea in 1995 of photoshopping the face of the Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin onto an SS officer's uniform. And they distributed this at demonstrations against Rabin, who at the time was trying to implement the Oslo Accords that would have granted Palestinians, or that were to grant Palestinians high levels of autonomy, possibly, and I use the word possibly with emphasis, leading to Palestinian statehood. So this imagery became ubiquitous. I already mentioned earlier about Netanyahu. And now, for example, you have things like in 2005, when Israeli forces withdrew from the Gaza Strip and they evacuated about 11,000 settlers. Here we have settlers wearing the yellow, or the stars that Jews were forced to wear in the Nazi ghettos. So they assume the identity of Holocaust victims. And on my right, the image of the Israeli ambassador to the UN and his delegation. This is during the Hamas-Israel war, and they are wearing yellow stars, associating again, to get back to where we started, the victims of October 7th and the threat presented to the state of Israel with the fate of Jews during the Second World War. So again, this becomes absolutely common. Now, I'm not saying that Israel is making these things up. I mean, anti-Semitism is a real problem, and Israel has dealt with anti-Semitic attitudes from throughout the world, and the Muslim and Arab world in particular. Just recently, the president of the Palestine Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, made just classic, uncategorically or unequivocally anti-Semitic statements to the global media. And Hamas, the organization that perpetrated the October 7th massacre, has historically featured very classic anti-Semitic rhetoric about Jewish wealth, global power, Jews behind revolutions throughout history, the Jews started World War I, and so forth, largely for financial gain. So this is just pure, classic anti-Semitism. Hamas toned down the anti-Semitism a bit in a statement of 2017, but this kind of anti-Semitic language has continued to be rife. So I'm not saying that the state of Israel has simply made it all up. I'm also not arguing that this is all manipulation. That is, historians tend to operate through what I would call a hermeneutic of suspicion. That is, they tend to think that politicians lie, that they are instrumental, that they are manipulative, and that they use, let's say, anti-Semitic Holocaust in order to, win the support of the masses. But what our scholars have pointed out is that politicians actually do have feelings, and they really do have beliefs. They might not have principles, but they have beliefs. And a lot of this Holocaust language that's been used over the last 75 years might very well be sincere. So, for example, when Hamas launched numerous suicide attacks within the state of Israel in the 1990s in an attempt to scupper the Oslo Accords, and in the 2000s during the second Intifada, obviously Israelis reacted with terror, with great fear, and they were receptive to the kind of language, let's say, that the prime minister used in 1999, Ehud Barak, when he visited a German concentration camp and talked about how we, the representatives of the state of Israel, have, we are now a strong, independent, and flourishing country, so there won't ever be a Holocaust again. But what he's really in a way trying to do, or the kind of complex that I'm talking about, is one of attempting to retroactively prevent the Holocaust. Now, then the other overarching analogy, which I think obviously is based in truth, like the anti-Semitism and Holocaust analogy, that Palestinians have developed, but I think they have exaggerated it, much to the detriment of possibilities for mutual acceptance and appreciation between Palestinians and Israeli Jews, is the analogy of colonialism and the Nakba. Already in 1965, the Palestinian researcher Fayez Sayegh wrote that Zionism was in many ways like European colonialism, but it was incompatible with the continued existence of the native population in the coveted country. That is, he claims that the Zionists right from the start were determined to eliminate the Palestinians. And it's really not true that the Zionists were determined from the start to eliminate the Palestinians, but this has become a kind of a very important aspect of Palestinian thought to help account for the Nakba and all of the oppression of the Palestinians since. The association between Zionism and colonialism, I think, was made very elegantly and quite intelligently in 1979 in a pioneering work by Edward Said, the Palestinian literary scholar, Zionism from the standpoint of its victims, in which he places Zionism, very much into the framework of colonialism, in that the parts of the world taken over by the Western powers in Africa and Asia were considered to be primitive and basically full of resources for the taking, and that could be rendered productive and a source of great wealth. The idea is that you take those human beings who might be, you take the native population, you put them in native homelands, you exploit their labor, and this is the kind of colonialism that he associates then with Zionism. And in particular, ever since the 1960s, really, both Western and Arab scholars have made a great deal of the alleged connection between Zionism and settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is a particular type of colonialism, which is less oriented towards the exploitation of the population and more oriented to expropriating them, to taking their land. And it's simply become a matter of course to refer to Zionism as a form of settler colonialism. There is a journal called Settler Colonial Studies, which has devoted several issues to Israel. And it's gotten to a point where if you read, let's say, an article I've read recently in a book comparing on how we think of the Holocaust and the Nakba together, very good book, there is an essay by a Palestinian scholar where the term colonial shows up literally 8 times on a single page. And Haifa is called a colony and Tel Aviv is called a colony, and the word is used so often that it simply loses meaning. On the other hand, there's of course a lot to it. It is possible for, as Herman Guillaume wrote about the Afrikaners in South Africa, who were themselves a colonized people by the British, but they became oppressive colonizers themselves. As he says, they were anti-colonial freedom fighters against the British, but they became, as he puts it, the polecat of the world through their support for and implementation of apartheid. So it is possible for the Zionist movement to have anti-colonial qualities, but certainly colonial qualities as well. As Herzl himself said in the late 1800s, that the Jewish state would be, quote, a rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. So clearly this is a, kind of classic colonial idea that the Western powers will impose order and bring benefit to, to the Middle East. Now, is this really the way life has functioned for Jews and Arabs in Israel-Palestine over the decades? Certainly before the late 1930s, there was a lot of daily interaction between Jews and Palestinians in the cities of Palestine and between the collective Jewish farms and the Palestinian villages. These sorts of social relationships were, I think, not coded as relationships between equals. That is, the Zionists saw themselves as bringing, superiority, right? Bringing a superior culture to the Palestinians through what they didn't use the term mission civilisatrice, but civilizing mission, but that was clearly much of the idea. But the idea of colonialism and the civilizing mission, it gets complicated in the fact that until the 1920s, the majority of Jews in Palestine were Afro-Asian. And since the 1950s, there's been the 50s and early 60s, there was mass migration of Afro-Asian Jews to Israel. And so is a Jew from Morocco or from, Egypt or from Iraq or from Lebanon or Syria or Libya or Tunisia, is such a Jew a settler? And if so, why? Are they any more or less a settler than, say, a Jew from Poland or, Romania or something? It was certainly commonly said by the leaders of the so-called Oriental, that is Eastern, Jewish communities during the 20s, 30s, even 40s, that they, as native Arabic speakers, as Jews who were from the region, that they could serve as mediators, between the Ashkenazic Jews who knew nothing about the Middle East and the Palestinian Arabs. I think a little bit of this was simply a search for power and a position of authority. What happened to a lot of these Jews of Middle Eastern origin, they wound up working for the security services in the early state of Israel because they knew Arabic. So the settler colonial model certainly works up to an extent. You can compare it with certain Western settler colonial practices, but we have to keep in mind that settler colonialism is not limited to the West. Settler colonialism has been a 20th century global phenomenon. And if we're going to look at Israel as an example of settler colonialism, we have to ask ourselves, well, maybe we should compare it with China's Sinicization of Tibet. By the way, just a couple of days ago, I was in front of University Hall looking at the graffiti that the Jews for Palestine had written on the asphalt after their occupation or during their occupation of the building. And I was looking at it, and then there appeared out of nowhere a Tibetan monk. And he said to me, well, what about our occupation? What about our state? And we talked about the Tibetan position and China's occupation of Tibet for a while, at which point I said to him, we need to pray for peace. And then he said, I'm a monk. I pray all the time. So that was very funny. There are other forms of settler colonialism. The Western Sahara, which has been colonized by Morocco in a way very similar to Israel's colonization of the West Bank, settling Moroccan citizens, providing kind of minimal autonomy to the Polisario Liberation Front, essentially demoting the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic to second-class status. It's very, very similar. And the fate of the Sahrawis in Western Sahara, these people are very angry that the world has ignored them, and that Israel, in fact, recognized Morocco's claim on the Western Sahara as one of the preconditions for the normalization accords. And by the way, if you look down here and you see a kind of Asian-looking person with a kind of a Caucasian-looking person, this is from Soviet Kazakhstan, which was actually, I think, the most gruesome and brutal form of settler colonialism in history, in that the Soviets wound up exporting millions of undesirables, Koreans, Poles, Ukrainians, you name it, people who they didn't, want to keep in whatever part of the Soviet Union they were in. They sent them to Kazakhstan, and about a third of the population of Kazakhstan died. About 2 million people were killed or died of malnutrition due to enforced famine. So, settler colonialism is not just a Western phenomenon. And if we're going to think about Israel in a colonial framework, it really needs to be a global one. And now, as I move to the end, I want to talk about the most common frameworks that people who use the colonial model like to refer to. One is the South African model, and the other is Algeria. So the South African model is very popular because of apartheid, that is the legally enforced discrimination, structural discrimination against people by race. But the problem with the apartheid analogy, which is much beloved, is it only works in really one way. If you look at the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of Apartheid from 1974, there are a number of passages that do resemble what the state of Israel does, let's say in the West Bank, basically inflicting harm upon members of a racial group, infringing their dignity, and so forth, even though it's not exactly racial in Israel-Palestine, it's more national. But I think the kind of oppression is at least more or less in the ballpark of what the Convention on Apartheid said. Arbitrary arrest and illegal imprisonment, that certainly has happened. Legislative measures designed to basically keep people from participating in the life of the country. The Palestinians in the West Bank are essentially without rights. So if you just look on a kind of a theoretical level, they're very different. They're very similar. What Israel does towards the Palestinians and apartheid might be similar, but the actual South African case was very different. And this is something that people really need to understand, that South Africa was much weaker than Israel. South Africa was 10% white. the blacks were the overwhelming component of the working class. South Africa was quite vulnerable in a way that Israel has not been. Even now, after 56 years of the post-67 occupation, it's about half and half, Jews and Arabs living between the river and the sea, as it were, to use that complicated phrase. So Israel's actually been able to survive Palestinian protest much more effectively than apartheid South Africa. The Palestinians tried to shake off Israeli rule during the intifadas of the late 80s, early 90s, and then the early 2000s, but Israel just shook them off. And they hired a bunch of guest workers from Ghana and Thailand and Romania and the Philippines. In other words, Israel has a much, much stronger economy. Its society, for all of its contentiousness, for all of its divisions, which we're seeing, quite strongly, or we've been seeing for the last year, Israel's a fairly sticky society. It's Jewish society. It's quite cohesive. And the South African and the Israeli cases are not really identical. And this is something, by the way, that the Palestinian political theorist Raef Zereik has acknowledged. He's acknowledged they're not the same. You cannot generalize from here's what happened in South Africa, and therefore if we do X, Y, Z, it will work in Israel. He says these are very different situations. And then the last model I want to mention is that of French Algeria, where there were European settlers who moved there in the 1800s and they were French citizens. They had a French-European style of life known as pied noir or black feet. And then they wound up leaving. They wound up leaving when Algeria became an independent state, and that has fed certain fantasies, in the Middle East that the Jews will simply just leave. The Israelis will all leave. They'll go, as one Hamas leader recently said, back to Poland, which I really don't think is going to happen. So the South African and the Algerian cases don't really apply, except there is one thing I want to say by way of conclusion that I think does apply. This is Albert Camus, a famous French-Algerian author, who was himself from a European settler family. And he talked about Algeria being his true country, this was his country, right? It's where he was born and raised. And then he says quite succinctly, in Algeria, French and Arabs are condemned to live or to die together. It's that simple. And the same thing is true for Israel-Palestine. They are condemned to live or to die together. And then just to conclude, the only way they can learn to live and not die together is by transcending these Procrustean analogies: Holocaust, anti-Semitism, colonialism, Nakba. Unless people change the way they think about history, they can't really change the way they think about the present. So I'm hoping that historical information in this sense might actually have some practical value. Thank you, and I'm sorry for my sniffing and coughing.
Thank you, Derek. Can you hear me, Derek?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah. Sorry I was late. But you were introduced, I believe, right?
Yes.
Thank you. I'm really sorry. So let's open this discussion. Questions? Yeah.
I guess my question is the next kind of logical, question would be, what are the alternatives for, historical analogies that everyone, should understand and be on the same page on? Because it's really easy to talk to someone and say, this is like apartheid. But if you are just you can't, in every discussion describe everything that happens and all the complexities and get to the point. So I guess, do you propose an alternative for historical analogies, or do you just caution against using them so generalized?
Yeah, it's a great question. The whole purpose of, I think, historical inquiry is not to indulge in sweeping categorizations. The purpose of historical inquiry is, as the great late historian Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi said, to keep us honest. That is, all national movements are based in myths, and as Yerushalmi himself writes in his beautiful book, Zahor, some myths are filled with value and meaning and deserve to be cherished. Others need to be exposed. and others need to be completely abandoned. So this is what I think is the purpose of historical inquiry. We have to leave it to other people, maybe the political scientists, to try to figure out the plans for how Jews and Palestinians can come up with some workable scheme so they can live as equals and achieve justice and security. There are the ethicists who will think about the morality of Zionism and the morality of, Palestinian nationalism. But I think the historians then, it's a much more modest claim. So the historian tries to figure out what didn't happen. And if they're lucky, they figure out what happened. I don't know, Omer might disagree with me, but I have a rather modest notion of what the historian can and cannot do. But I think it's absolutely essential. It's a necessary, if not sufficient, precondition for clearing away false analogy. And I think basically any overarching analogy is by definition, if not false, then certainly deeply flawed.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there seems to be a sort of shared assumption among people, non-academics, when they talk about these things, that arguing about the past or determining, whose narrative is correct determines what the future should be. Do you think that this sort of connection between what we should do going forward and determining what happened in the past is something that should be severed, or?
Well,
Do you agree with it?
I'll tell an interesting story. So some years ago, before he died, obviously, I spent an afternoon with the Israeli writer Amos Oz, who was quite a champion of Palestinian statehood, and he and Sari Nusseibeh had a kind of they had a road show. They went all around the world talking about peace and the like. And then I asked Oz about his own views of the 1948 war, and they were quite traditional. In other words, he had a view of the 1948 war that was completely what he had learned, let's say, as a child in the 1950s. He had no either willingness to or desire to accept any of the findings of the so-called new historians, which are not new, because this stuff goes back to the 1980s. It's like saying New College at Oxford is new, because it's from 1379. It's not new. It's newer than something else. But he and his Palestinian interlocutor basically put the past behind them, which I think is very interesting. The one thing that I think we learned from history that's quite banal, but just because something is banal doesn't mean it's not true, is that the Israeli Jews and the Palestinians are not going anywhere. It's amazing how difficult it is to get this obvious point of view across to invested people at this moment. In a way, what I was saying just now, I think the New York Times, Roger Cohen summed it up in about 1,000 words in the New York Times today. So I think history can have, history can certainly show us paths not taken. It can give us examples of people whom we find admirable. It can give us examples of ways of thinking that are destructive. But it does not, history does not provide, in and of itself, does not provide like a blueprint. Other people have to come up with that. They could be historians, but they're not going to be functioning as historians. They do something else. I don't know if that answers the question.
Thank you.
There's a lot of people in there. I didn't see you when I was talking because you were very small dots, and now you're very big dots.
So I want to ask something, because this is a really complicated issue. So I think you are sort of presenting two possibilities. One is what was attempted as an idea in the book that you referred to, that you alluded to, the Amos Goldberg, Bashir book, The Holocaust and the Nakba, which talks about the sort of underlying motif of it, and the long introduction that was published separately before, talks about that each side should recognize the historical trauma of the other side. not to agree with it, but just to recognize that both sides have a kind of historical burden that they carry. And if they understand that, then that would be the path to thinking of a common future. The other option, which I think you representing here or trying to present here, is what the Oslo Accords were based on, basically. It was, listen, things happen, we have a history, it's not necessarily a good history, let's look forward. Let's decide what the 0 point is, what 0 hour is, and let's move forward. And the question is, which one would work? Because when you say, let's move forward, you're saying, okay, in 48, we expelled you guys, but we're not talking about that. We're moving forward. Or you say, yeah, the Jews always wanted to have a state of their own, and that's why they have a law of return, because they want to know that this is a haven, but let's move forward and say, no, we do away with that. That is, can you actually do that, not using history as an analogy, but actually recognizing or not how people think of themselves, what forms them, what they believe forms them as a group, as a collective. So I don't know, where do you stand on that?
Well, first of all, I don't agree with Amos Oz. I do think people need to know the history. And he simply had beliefs that were just not true. Right. And people need to know what really happened and what really didn't happen. Ideally, that kind of historical knowledge would lead to deep conversations, truth and reconciliation, mutual recognition, and so on. That book that you've referred to calls for, and I think it's just quoting, they're quoting Dominic LeCapra, I think, about empathetic unsettlement, that you're trying to unsettle your reader, make them uncomfortable, your interlocutor, but you do understand their position. The problem I have with this is that they referred to Ghassan Kanafani, one of the kind of court intellectual, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, as displaying empathy with the Jews who basically drove his family out of Haifa and dispossessed him. But he doesn't. He understands them somewhat, but he wants to kill them. I mean, he wants to destroy them. And this is where we have to be careful not to fall into the, I think, somewhat romanticized notion that knowledge of the other leads inexorably to some kind of appreciation of the other. So I'm going to be speaking, if I get over COVID in time, at a conference in Germany in about 10 days on a project called Ambivalent Enmity, which is basically about how groups like Palestinians, Kurds, Berbers, and so forth imitate certain aspects or emulate certain aspects of their oppressors. But this is quite instrumental. And I remember years ago, I had a conversation with a brilliant Egyptian historian about the 1967 war, who really believed that, Egypt's ground forces were far from defeated in 1967, but who was deeply admiring of the Israeli military. But it was clear why. I mean, he wanted Egypt to have a stronger military so that it could confront Israel. I mean, so that it could confront Israel. So knowledge in and of itself is not therapeutic. In the Middle Ages, Dominican and Franciscan monks who had never learned Aramaic and read the Talmud for the first time. And they found out that Jews had developed a belief system that had nothing to do with the Hebrew Bible. And they were furious because they had seen Jews as kind of fossilized ancient Israelites living the life of the Christian era, the early Christian era. They found out Jews had done something totally different. They were furious. Knowledge actually made it worse. Or just to finish with a true story, but it's funny. I was on a plane many years ago on the way to Israel via Rome, and I was sitting next to an Italian teenager who was off to visit family, and she asked me what I did, and I made the mistake of telling her. And she said, "Oh, well, you Jews, you believe in Jesus, don't you?" And I said, "Well, no, actually, we don't. That's actually, that's rather a big point of difference between the two faiths." And then she said, "Oh, now I know why we hate you." So the historical knowledge in and of itself is not the issue. there has to be a genuine recognition, not just that the other side thinks that they've been traumatized, but that they have been traumatized. That's the difference. And that is the element that I think is going to be much harder, of course, for Palestinians as the weaker party, as the party that is suffering more. That's going to be very, very difficult. It has been very difficult, with some exceptions, right? There are exceptions. But no, I think history is a very important part of the, therapeutic framework. But we have to be very careful what kind of historical knowledge we're teaching and what we expect from it.
To build off, can you hear me?
Speaking of the microphone.
To build off of what you were just saying with trauma being kind of embedded into the identity of both parties, and also kind of to build off of what you were saying, I think you brought up identity. What do you do then when this analogy is so much tied to identity and less to narrative? Because if you're identifying in a very specific way, then you can't just change your mind so easily. So it's kind of like, I feel like that's one of the big struggles in this, or conflicts.
It's hugely difficult. And I think there are frameworks in which these changes can be made. A university class where you have 14 weeks or 15 weeks or whatever to go into the subject in depth. But what if you don't have that kind of time? And what if you don't have a wise professor like Omer Bartov to guide you? What do you do? So I had a rather chastening experience at Harvard a few years ago when an actor / writer put together a little show called Wrestling Jerusalem. He plays like 18 different characters, various kinds of Jewish characters in Israel, various kinds of Arab characters. And, I thought it was maybe a little sentimental. But I realized as I was watching it, we were watching a film of it at Harvard, and there were about 30 people in the room. And I looked at the faces of the people who were watching it. They were transfixed. Because what would happen is at some point in the movie, this man would perform a character with whom somebody in the audience identified and sympathized. They'd say, oh, that's just like me. And then this person would perform another character. And I'm pretty sure people in the audience, or actually they said so afterwards, it's like, okay, so this person represented my view so well that when this person represented the other point of view, I found myself, basically I lost my fear-threat reaction, and I was open to dealing with this character's humanity. So again, this is not for the historians to do, it's for the psychologists and the sociologists and the professional peacemakers, but there are ways to communicate these sorts of appreciations of trauma and humanity that don't require 14 weeks and, God forbid, a term paper. I want to know that Brown students are more curious and more willing to ask probing questions than Harvard students.
Yeah, there you go, Jacob. Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
So you've talked mostly about how historical analogies have been used specifically by Israelis and Palestinians, but over the last month and more, we've also seen especially the Holocaust analogy play out in especially European and German discourses.
Yeah.
So do you see kind of the German use of the cultural use of the Holocaust analogy in German culture and maybe in Western Europe in general as coming from a similar place as the Israeli Association?
I think it's coming from a different place. The Israeli use of the analogy is the assumption of the role of victim. The European use is the assumption of guilt over being a perpetrator. That's very different. And I believe it is much less hardy. I saw a public opinion poll, that 70% of Germans now say that they want to move on from the Holocaust. And my own sense of Germany is that although there's a very active public sphere of politicians, civil society, organizations that perpetuate Holocaust memory, that the foundation of this official memory is actually fraying. And another generation, it'll be gone. Ironically, the further Israel gets from the Holocaust, the stronger and not weaker the bonds with the Holocaust become. So it's very different. And that's why I'm focusing really on how the parties to the conflict are making use of analogies to basically to justify and to account to themselves who they are, what they are, and why they suffer. There's an international relations scholar named Jennifer Mitzen who wrote a classic article about 15 years ago on ontological security, and that regimes, state regimes, can engage in all kinds of risky and really quite damaging behaviors, but those cognitive routines can give people a tremendous sense of identification. They know exactly who and what they are, and this is exactly what's going on now in Israel-Palestine. People are suffering horrifically, but they're being told by the regimes, here's why you're suffering. And you know exactly who you are because of your suffering. So that's very different from the case of former perpetrator regimes in Western and Central Europe.
Monty.
Thank you for your talk. I had a question about the South Africa analogy, and specifically about truth and reconciliation.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking of kind of how that was enacted, and people like Alan Bosak or Desmond Tutu drawing on kind of common theological understandings as a way to have truth and reconciliation. Do you see a possibility for that dynamic also in Israel and Palestine, or is the kind of the cultural and theological divide so great that that kind of rhetoric is not a possibility?
Yeah, it's interesting because the Dutch Reformed Church, or the Afrikaans Reformed Church, was actually a common element for many people, regardless of race, in South Africa. Yeah, it's a lot tougher in Israel-Palestine, although it's funny, if you get away from the Middle East and you get into the senior common rooms of Oxbridge, you will find groups of scholars devoted to Jewish, Muslim, I don't like to use the word dialogue, but serious intellectual exchange about common faith traditions and common concepts, because theologically, Islam and Judaism have a lot in common. But my concern is actually much more practical and political. That is, Nelson Mandela said on the day he was released from jail, he said that whites have a place in South Africa. And they have every right to be here. And he, of course, drew on that even more in his inaugural speech 15 years later. I think this is what is needed, is a practical recognition, active recognition, which is not a theological one. And we're not there. We don't have a Mandela and we don't have a de Klerk. Israel's leadership at the moment is abysmal, and the Palestinians' own leadership, as you saw with the reference to Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestine Authority's own leadership, at least at the very top, is deeply problematic. So no, I don't think that theological, interaction is necessarily the most important thing. I think it's a much more pragmatic recognition. It's something that actually one of my non-academic colleagues at Harvard said to me. And again, it's quite banal, but it's also true. You have every right to be here. You have every right to be here. Now let's figure out what to do. Yes, apologies, to get back to Omer's question about history. Apologies, recognition, and then we move forward. So it's not amnesia. I'm not advocating historical amnesia, which is what Oz was talking about. But we don't want to get stuck in the morass of historical debate. That's what worries me.
Based off your answer to that last question, do you think that these protests, both pro-Palestinian and pro-Israel around the world, are hindering this recognition and perpetuating these analogies? Do you think that they're helpful in any way, or that they are just continuing this divisive language? Really,
that's a really interesting question, because I don't want to deny the value of nonviolent civil protest, and people, of course, have the right to engage in it. The question is, what does it accomplish? So then you use history and you say, okay, well, when has there been a mass protest movement that really made a difference? Well, one could argue that the anti-apartheid movements of, let's say, the mid to late 1970s through the mid 80s made a difference. But that was largely also because South Africa was in a much more fragile state, as I've said, than Israel. But maybe Israel will become more fragile. I don't know. The other thing is the Vietnam War. I mean, I teach a course on war in the modern world, and there's a whole cottage industry of books written by now graying or quite gray Vietnam War anti-war activists who talk about how the anti-war movement on the university campuses turned America against the war. And so far as I can tell, that's just not true. What happened was that most Americans actually supported the war until the early 1970s, and they got tired of it because just too many of their kids were getting killed. And as wasn't it Lyndon Johnson who said, if I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost America? So that was already before 1968. The protests did not really, now the moratorium may have, if you know about this, this was 10 million people in the streets throughout the United States, but this was not limited to campuses. This was a true mass movement. So that might make a big difference. But I think that the protests that have largely been going on university campuses probably don't help a whole lot. And that's why I said at the very beginning, I would much rather that we use the universities in order to learn. Doesn't mean we have to agree. But on the other hand, I believe very much in freedom of expression. And if students want to walk into Harvard Yard and shout things, they have the right to do it. I just don't think it's very helpful. So yes, protest has a place, but you have to think about what you're trying to accomplish and how do you do it without alienating the people whom you're trying to reach. What's much more important right now than what's happening in protests throughout America is the change in public opinion towards Israel-Palestine. Only 30% of Democrats support Israel at the moment, much lower than historically has been the case. Only 60% of Republicans. This is unheard of in American history. This is new. And that's not because of students at Harvard or NYU or Columbia demonstrating. It's because of the way that scores of millions of Americans are perceiving what's actually happening in Israel-Palestine. So again, I think we should focus on where the change is coming, why it's happening.
Thank you.
Thanks again for this really phenomenal talk. I'm trying to separate in my own mind the issue of, on the one hand, competing discourses and competing trauma, and maybe an inability to empathize on both sides, or on many different sides. That's on the one hand. And then the other, there's this very real violent conflict where people are killing each other, and both sides have the capacity clearly demonstrated to kill each other. Maybe different levels, different approaches, but still the capacity to kill each other and the willingness to do it. And how does one, what's the relationship between those two things, and kind of intellectual, emotional engagement, and then an engagement of violent conflict? So I guess part of me feels like, well, there's no point in discussing trying to come to some common understanding of each other, because in the end, there's still people killing each other. And in fact, the killing itself makes a common understanding impossible. But on the other, I guess my limited notion of history, my own memories say that, well, it wasn't that long after 1973 that we got to Camp David, and which suggests that maybe at some point people just get tired of killing each other and something breaks, and they're willing to come to some kind of new settlement. It may not solve everything, but at least it's some kind of new rearranged status quo, and a more peaceful one. So I realize that's a roundabout non-question, but is there some way to make sense of these two possibilities? One, just the sinking into deeper and deeper intractable violence, making discussion impossible, versus somehow, I don't know whether it's a fatigue from violence and a willingness to sit down and talk.
More often than not, and maybe I'm just revealing my realist, capital R realist approach, states begin to consider that their interests are best served by making peace. So for example, the Egyptian decision, Anwar Sadat's decision to go to Jerusalem was made largely because Egypt could not afford to keep the Suez Canal closed. They needed it opened. And they were no longer getting the economic benefit from the relationship with the Soviet Union that they were getting. They needed an entree to the West, particularly the United States. So these were very practical reasons. Egypt had its partial victory in 1973 to present to the Egyptian public with its great war memorial in Tahrir Square of, the great victory of the pontoon, what do you call them? The little, not dinghies, the little, what are they now? The little boats that they went across the Egyptian soldiers went across the Suez Canal. So this was actually very practical. It was very pragmatic. And the story is, I don't know if it's true, that Yasser Arafat was moved towards acceptance of Israel already during the siege of Beirut in the early 1980s, when the bombs were falling, and one of Arafat's aides said to him, well, do you now accept that Israel exists? What are we going to do with this? And there had been signs of that kind of moderation in smaller Palestinian factions already in the early 1970s. But it's not about ideals, and it's not really about fatigue. It's about interests. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Now, Oslo's a little different, because the men who negotiated Oslo, it was a couple of Israeli academics and a couple of professional Palestinian diplomats, and they were coming from a position of fatigue. They were just sick of the whole thing. But I don't think that's what motivated Yitzhak Rabin to endorse the Oslo Accords, even though once the Accords were signed, it seems that he actually began to move more towards accepting the possibility of Palestinian statehood. We shouldn't exaggerate that. As Henry Kissinger said at his funeral, Yitzhak Rabin was not a flower child. So I think that for the leaders in the very top, the summit, it's not about battle fatigue. It's about interest. And we have to think about ways to satisfy the interests of Israelis and Palestinians. And that's very hard at the moment, because both Israel and Hamas are led by people who are quite irrational. And you look at the current Israeli government, and I don't know what will come out of this war in terms of, a new Israeli government, a rejuvenated Palestine Authority. But I really do think it's ultimately about collective interest.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm a political scientist, and I want to take up the question, offer a slightly different argument about the role of protest and connect it to public opinion. So if we start with the analogy between Israel and South Africa, I mean, it's not a perfect analogy. It has some uses. But one of the things that is very different about these two cases is that South Africa did not have a diaspora of supporters the way Israel does. And so, it was weaker economically. It didn't have a diaspora of supporters. Israel has that. And, the South African apartheid lasted for 42 years. The occupation's now on to 56 years. I mean, the fact that there is this, diaspora that's supportive of Israel suggests to us that this case will be harder to resolve, because there's that element there that didn't exist in South Africa. So then getting back to the issue of protests, I would argue that protests do have an effect, but not the connection, the causal path you were suggesting. I agree that those student protests have very little effect on the university presidents. They aren't going to divest anytime soon. But you mentioned how public opinion about Israel is changing quite dramatically. And I think the role of this protest, and especially to the extent they're by Jewish young people, that's a strong signal to the Jewish community. I mean, if the US shielding of Israel is ever going to change, right? Diplomatic shielding of Israel is ever going to change, it'll require first a shift in domestic politics in the US, and the shift in perception, especially of some members of the Jewish community, the supporters of Israel. And that shift is likely going to come about because the younger members of the sort of this community supporting Israel get a new perception of Israel. And so these protests, right? the Jewish federations are looking at this, right? And the mainstream Jewish organizations are watching all their young people protesting. That is, to me, is where one of the contributions of the protests.
No, it's a really good point for the 2% or so of the American population that's Jewish. And you're right that there is a split. There is a growing polarization that actually dates back 20 years or more of younger American Jews being less attached to Israel. And the occupation of University Hall at Harvard last week was led by or carried out by Jewish students, Jews for Palestine. I don't know, honestly, how that is playing in East Brunswick, right? My own world in Toronto, where I actually have my permanent home, what I call Bathurst Street, which is where we have 200,000 Jews who live within half a kilometer of Bathurst Street in Toronto. I don't think they're much aware, frankly, of Jewish youth protesting. And if they were, they would be absolutely horrified because they're quite conservative. But I agree with you that the younger Jews will have different views. They do have different views about Israel. They're taking a different tack. My concern, though, is that it's precisely those Jews who have been telling me that they will not vote for Joe Biden in 2024. They'll vote for Cornel West or for Jill Stein or whatever, which means that Trump will become president and Israel will be given even more free rein to do what it wants. But I agree with you that about the generational change. It's been enormous. That's true, but there aren't that many Jews in America. What really matters is 70 million evangelical Christians. That matters a lot more than Jews in the United States right now, because they're not giving up their support for Israel, as we saw from the Washington March and Reverend John Hagee.
Yes, I just wanted to follow up on this point quickly. Can you sort of quantify this shift in in the public opinion of many Jewish people? Because we see the protests and we see the activists, but that doesn't really necessarily speak for, or it's hard to know whether or not these people to what extent they speak for Jews as a whole.
Yeah, it's a really good question. The numbers are in my newest book is called Zionism and Emotional State, and it came out a few months ago, and I have the numbers in there, so I just have to see if I can remember them. That what's happened is, at least according to statistics from like 2020, 2021, it's not that younger American Jews, like under 35, under 30, it's not that they have given up on Israel or become hostile to Israel. It's that they've experienced what I call an emotional cooling. That is, the percentage of those who say, I am very attached to Israel has gone down. The percentage of those who say, I am somewhat attached has gone up. But it's still something like 70% of American Jewry under the age of 30. So it's still quite high. Now, you have to factor out Orthodox Jews who are overwhelmingly deeply attached to Israel. So I don't think the change is one of abandonment. It's one of cooling. That's probably what's happening on a larger level than the kind of spectacular things that we're seeing going on by Jewish students, demonstrating on behalf of Palestine at universities. But the change is real. And again, it goes back quite a long time, but I'm sure it's been now accelerated by the events of the last 6 weeks.
Other comments? Can I just ask you one last thing that is sort of related to something you said before, which is the way I see when we talk about politics now, Israel has made decisions during its lifetime that had to do with power, with either feeling very powerful and therefore being able to keep what it wanted and not worrying too much about settling things with other states or groups, or feeling more vulnerable. Right. And I think and I wonder what you think about the following, because the way I've been thinking about it, and there's a 50-year divide, and I sort of experienced both of them. So 73 and 2023. And in 73, basically what happened was that, or one could see it that way, that Egypt had been putting out feelers for some arrangement with Israel if it could get the Sinai Peninsula back he might have peace with Israel. And Israel said, well, we'd rather keep the Sinai Peninsula than have peace because we won in 67, and what are you guys going to do to us? And then came the war, and 3,000 people, some classmates of mine, got killed. And then Israel said, okay, well, in that case, let's have peace and you can have the Sinai Peninsula. And what happened in 2023 was that Israel had been saying for 20 years, certainly under Netanyahu, we can manage the conflict with the Palestinians, let's have other things. Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, things are good, the Gulf states, and nobody gives a hoot about the Palestinians. And what could they do to us? Lob a few rockets at us. And October 2023, turns out they could, and they did, and the country is in shock and feels deeply insecure. And the question is, will it now be able to do what it did after 73? That is say, okay, we've recognized the limits of our power. We have to deal with this because otherwise we're stuck with this mutual killing. Never mind empathy and history and all that. We have to move on because this is not manageable the way we thought it was. So I don't know, have you had thoughts about that?
Well, as you know, Omer, from your own work, that it's very difficult to compare, say, the peace negotiations with Egypt over the Sinai with the Palestinian issue. It's just very different. And also, Israel drove a hard bargain in the negotiations with Sadat, earning, Begin Dzerzhinsky's undying hatred. So they did drive a hard bargain, and they did pretty much ignore the Palestinian issue in the Camp David negotiations. So Egypt got what it wanted. Israel could do without the Sinai. It's harder for most Israelis to imagine what would happen in Gaza or especially the West Bank. I mean, the ideological connections, you know all this better than I do. Of course, there are so-called centrists in Israel, and there is a very smart, originally thinking Israeli political scientist in R.A. Krampf, who really believes, as you just intimated, that we may see the formation of a more centrist government that is precisely because Israel is more dependent on the US than ever, precisely because the illusion of complete impunity has been shattered, that Israel may have to make some concessions, start making concessions. But we can't do this as long as people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and, the cabinet ministers from Likud are in power. But sure, it's possible, but I do think it is qualitatively different, the cases of Egypt and the Palestinian issue, because everything starts with the Palestinian issue and everything will end with it. And so again, to get back to the problem of analogy, I'm not sure we can analogize from Camp David to what's happening now, but maybe it'll happen.
Well, listen, thank you for leaving us with this great hope for the future. And Derek, thank you just for doing this despite being under the weather. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you all. Thank you for your questions and comments. And sorry I couldn't be there in person. And hope everybody avoids COVID.